Some families have a way of making you feel like a lighthouse steady shining for others, even as your own fuel runs low. My name is Nora Taylor, and for as long as I can remember, I was the responsible one. Maybe you know that feeling too. The one who answers every late-night call, fills every empty fridge, and quietly patches every hole before the storm breaks. It's a strange kind of love, the sort that makes you proud and weary in equal measure. Looking back, I realize I became my family's safety net long before I even understood what that meant. There's a myth in every culture, but especially in America, that sacrifice is the same thing as love. We grow up hearing stories about children who save the day, siblings who give without question, the dutiful son or daughter who quietly holds everything together. At first, I thought that was my happy ending to be needed. I paid hospital bills, covered rent when jobs fell through, and ran a family fund that was supposed to keep us safe. But what happens when the net becomes a trap? What happens when being the helper means losing sight of your own life? I used to tell myself it was just a rough patch, that things would balance out if I just kept giving a little more. But as the years went by, the gratitude faded, and the requests kept coming bigger, bolder, and somehow always just out of reach. I watched as the people I loved most forgot how to stand on their own feet. Sometimes I would catch myself staring at my bank app late at night, wondering if I was helping or enabling, if my yes had become a silent permission for everyone to lean a little harder, ask a little more. If you've ever felt invisible in your own story, if you've been the strong one, the fixer, the good daughter or good son, this is for you. Because behind every quiet sacrifice is a person who deserves to be seen, heard, and cared for too. This story isn't just about money or family drama. It's about what happens when love gets tangled up with obligation, when boundaries blur, and when finally, for the sake of your own heart, you have to let go. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step out of the role everyone expects and write a new chapter for yourself. I didn't know it then, but the day I received that message, just a few words, a digital thumbs up, would be the day everything changed. It would be the start of the hardest and most freeing journey of my life. I hope as you listen, you'll find pieces of your own story here, and maybe even the permission you've been waiting for to choose yourself too. It started the way these things often do, not with a crisis, but with a quiet call for help. My little brother Danny had landed in the emergency room after an accident at his part-time job. Insurance wouldn't cover the surgery he needed, and my parents sounded more lost than I'd ever heard them. Without thinking, I emptied my savings to cover the hospital bill. No one said thank you, but their relief was palpable. I told myself that's what family does. It was just one time I thought, a small sacrifice for people I loved. I didn't realize I was setting a precedent that would shape the next decade of my life. That first act of giving grew into a habit. Soon my mother called about overdue rent. My father needed help refinancing his truck. Danny fell behind on tuition, and every time he stumbled, I caught him. Each request felt urgent, and each yes made it harder to say no the next time. I watched my own plans, graduate school, a trip abroad. Even little things like dinners out slip further away. I convinced myself I could handle it, that I was lucky to be in a position to help. But deep down, I wondered if love should ever feel like a never-ending bill. In America, we're raised to believe that families help each other no matter what. I read stories online, strangers who drained their 401ks to keep a sibling out of debt, friends who took second jobs to pay for a parent's surgery. There's even a term for it, parentification, when children take on adult responsibilities far too soon. I recognize pieces of myself in every tale. We become the fixers not out of selfishness, but because somewhere along the line, love and obligation got so tightly tangled that we forgot where one ended and the other began. The trouble is, when giving becomes routine, gratitude quietly disappears. I noticed my family stopped asking if I could help, they simply expected it. Birthdays and holidays turned into subtle accounting sessions. My successes weighed not for pride, but for how they could be used to plug another financial hole. The more I gave, the less I felt like a daughter, and the more I felt like an endless resource. The lesson came slowly, but it was clear. Sacrifice, when it's not met with respect or boundaries, breeds resentment rather than closeness. Still, for years I kept telling myself this was just what good families do. I looked for signs of appreciation, a smile, a soft thank you, a sense of belonging. But these moments became fewer as the debts grew larger. I wanted to believe things would get better if I just held on a little longer, if I just kept giving. But somewhere inside, I knew a reckoning was coming, a moment when I'd have to decide whether to keep rescuing or finally start saving myself. That moment, as you'll see, arrived sooner than I ever expected. The strange thing about becoming the go-to helper is how quickly gratitude can dissolve into expectation. At first, my family's requests came with soft apologies, promises they'd pay me back when things improved, little notes tucked into birthday cards. But over time, the apologies disappeared. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was just that my help became the new normal. If I ever hesitated or asked for time to think, a shadow would pass over my mother's face, or my brother's tone would turn sharp. They weren't being cruel, just used to leaning on me the way one leans on a sturdy railing. I began to notice subtle shifts in our conversations. Money was never discussed directly, but it hovered in every phone call and family dinner, an invisible guest at the table. Once, when I was late sending my brother a loan for his car repair, my father texted, "He really counts on you, Nora." There was no malice, just the quiet certainty that I'd step in. I heard similar stories from friends. One spent her bonus paying off her mother's debt. Another covered a sibling's legal fees. None of them could remember the last time anyone asked if it was too much. Sometimes I'd try to push back gently. I'd mention my own rising rent or a work project that had me stressed. The response was always the same, a brief silence, then a shift to someone else's crisis. It wasn't lost on me that whenever I mentioned my own needs, they seemed almost invisible. I came across an article online about invisible labor and saw myself in every line, the strong, silent fixer, whose struggles are always second to someone else's. It made me wonder how many of us are quietly drowning in obligations we never chose. It's a common mistake, I think, to believe that being strong means never asking for help. In reality, strength without support becomes a burden. If we're not careful, our love can quietly morph into resentment. I learned that lesson on a cold winter night when, after wiring money to cover my mother's rent, I realized I didn't have enough left for my own groceries. I sat at my kitchen table, oatmeal cooling in the bowl, and wondered how I'd ended up here hungry in my own home, too embarrassed to ask for help. That night, I promised myself I'd pay more attention to my own needs. But promises are easier to make than keep. My family's expectations grew, and my voice grew smaller, almost swallowed up by the needs of everyone around me. Still, a small part of me was beginning to wake up, a quiet awareness that maybe it was time to reclaim some space for myself. That spark of hope would grow stronger in the days ahead, especially as my family's requests became harder to justify, and I started to see the line between love and obligation more clearly than ever before. The breaking point didn't come in a dramatic confrontation. Instead, it slipped in quietly, an ordinary Saturday, the kind that makes you think everything is fine until it isn't. My family's group chat buzzed with messages. My brother wanted help with a deposit on a new apartment. My mother asked if I could cover a last-minute medical bill, and my aunt hinted about her leaky roof. I stared at the screen, the requests piling up, and felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I didn't answer right away. I just sat there listening to my own pulse, wondering what would happen if I finally said no. That evening, a friend invited me to her birthday dinner, and as I considered going, the familiar tug of guilt crept in. Was I being selfish? Shouldn't I save that money for family emergencies? But then I thought about all the plans I'd put on hold, the little joys I'd sacrificed in the name of being there. I remembered a podcast about boundaries, how people, especially women, are taught to conflate love with self-denial. The guest shared her experience the moment she stopped funding her sister's shopping sprees. Her family accused her of being cold and ungrateful. It was the price she paid for choosing herself. When I finally replied to the group chat, I kept my message simple. I can't help this time. I need to focus on my own finances for a while. Silence. Then a flurry of responses, confusion, disappointment, hints of hurt. My brother wrote, "You've changed, Nora." My mother followed up with a sad face emoji. In that moment, the room felt heavier than ever, but also lighter, as if I'd cracked a window after years of stale air. I knew I was breaking an unspoken rule, the one that said my needs should always come last. The hardest part about setting boundaries isn't the pushback from others, it's the storm of feelings inside yourself. Doubt, guilt, even a sense of betrayal. But as I walked to my friend's dinner that night, laughter spilling out of the restaurant, I realized I'd survived my first no. I told my story to a colleague who admitted she'd lost touch with her own joy after years of family demands. We laughed, cried, and promised to do better for ourselves. The lesson was clear: boundaries don't end love. They make room for healthier, more honest connections. Of course, one no doesn't rewrite a lifetime of patterns. The next morning, the group chat buzzed again, softer now, but still full of expectation. I understood finally that I'd have to keep drawing those lines over and over until they were strong enough to hold. And as difficult as it felt, I also sensed a new beginning. The first step toward reclaiming my life, not just as the family rescuer, but as Nora, someone worthy of care, rest, and joy, simply for being herself. After that first no, I realized how important it was to have proof of my journey. I started keeping records: every payment, every transfer, every promise made and forgotten. At first it felt cold, almost transactional, but as I scrolled through old bank statements and email receipts, I saw the pattern laid bare. There it was, year after year of support with no questions asked, and rarely a thank you. I read about others online who'd done the same, sometimes to protect themselves from being gaslit, sometimes just to remind themselves that their sacrifices were real and worthy of acknowledgement. One day I heard about a woman named Lisa, who spent a decade quietly paying her brother's debts. When her family accused her of being selfish for finally stepping back, she showed them a spreadsheet: every loan, every grocery bill, every midnight bailout. The room went silent. Sometimes having evidence isn't about blaming anyone. It's about telling the truth when memory blurs or feelings run high. As I built my own folder of receipts and notes, I felt less crazy, less alone. It was a quiet declaration: I have been here. I have given. My care counts. But gathering evidence also meant facing some hard truths. Seeing it all in black and white, I noticed how little space I'd left for my own needs. I had paid for everything from car repairs to overdue rent, even birthday gifts I could barely afford. There were times I skipped doctor's appointments or let bills pile up, convinced the family's emergencies mattered more than my own health. It hurt to realize how small I'd allowed my own life to become in the name of love. Yet this clarity was the first step toward change. The lesson was simple, but it took years to learn. You are allowed to keep track of what you give. You're allowed to name your boundaries and to say enough when it becomes too much. Evidence is not a weapon. It's a lifeline, a way to hold on to reality when the world insists your feelings are exaggerated or your memory is flawed. As I scrolled through my files late one evening, I felt a quiet pride. I wasn't holding grudges. I was honoring my effort, even if no one else ever did. With each new document saved, I grew a little stronger, a little less afraid of what would happen if I finally shared the truth. I knew the time was coming when I'd need to show my family exactly what I'd carried for them. The next part of my journey wouldn't be about silence or secrecy. It would be about finally bravely telling the whole story, trusting that the truth, however uncomfortable, was the only path to real change. When I finally stepped back, the shift in my family was immediate and jarring. Suddenly, every small crisis became urgent. My brother's bank account went into overdraft. My mother's prescriptions lapsed. And even the family's group chat, once full of idle jokes and weekend plans, turned tense and transactional. There was a sense of panic beneath their messages, a realization that the quiet net I'd woven under their lives had disappeared. I expected frustration, but I hadn't prepared for the feeling of emptiness, as if all the noise that once filled my days was replaced by a strange, almost guilty quiet. What surprised me most was how quickly blame replaced gratitude. When the electricity bill bounced, my father left voicemails tinged with accusation. "How could you do this to us?" My brother said I was abandoning them in their hour of need. It was as if my years of support had vanished, replaced by disappointment and anger. I read about others who'd faced the same pattern: helpers, who once they set boundaries became the villains of their family's story. One therapist called it the scapegoat shift, when the person who keeps things afloat is suddenly blamed for letting the ship sink. It's easy in these moments to question yourself. Was I heartless? Was I letting everyone down? But as I connected with others, online forums, support groups, friends who'd been through similar storms, I realized this was a familiar script. Families that lean too heavily on one member often ignore their pain until the help is gone, then lash out when forced to stand on their own. The stories echoed mine. The first no is met with confusion, the second with anger, the third with a barrage of guilt. But slowly people began to rebuild their lives on both sides of the story. Through it all, I learned an important lesson. Letting go doesn't mean you failed your family. It means you trust them enough to face their own challenges, and yourself enough to finally rest. A friend once told me rescuers need rescuing too. I repeated those words like a mantra, letting them steady me during the hardest nights. The fallout was real, relationships shifted, silences deepened, but there was also the quiet promise of something new. For the first time, I had room to think about my future, not just everyone else's. As the dust settled, I noticed a new emotion settling in relief. Not because my family struggled, but because I could finally hear my own thoughts again. The absence of constant emergencies made space for reflection and eventually for hope. The next chapter of my life wouldn't be written by obligation or expectation. It would be shaped by choice, by honesty, and maybe, just maybe, by the kind of love that begins within and radiates outward. As my family adjusted to my absence from their financial lives, a new role emerged for me, the villain. It was startling to realize how quickly the rescuer can be recast as the problem simply for refusing to shoulder everyone's burdens. My brother's messages turned sharp, and my mother's disappointment became palpable in every conversation. I came across articles about the family scapegoat, how in times of upheaval, families often direct blame at the one who changes the pattern. It stung to realize my years of help didn't protect me from being painted as selfish or cruel. But I also knew this story was bigger than me. The first time I confided in a friend about being cast as the villain, she nodded knowingly. She'd been through it too, accused of abandoning her family when she stopped lending money. In support groups, I heard stories from people across the country, all with different details, but the same refrain. The moment I set a boundary, I became the bad guy. It was oddly comforting to know I wasn't alone. We talked about how boundaries threaten dysfunctional systems, and how those who benefit most from the status quo are often the loudest in their outrage. That realization helped soften my guilt. I began to see that being misunderstood or even disliked wasn't the end of the world. It was, in fact, a necessary cost of healing. I learned that when you stop playing a role that serves others but hurts yourself, some people will resist accuse and even rewrite history to suit their needs. But others often quietly, sometimes years later, reach out with understanding and even gratitude. One woman from my online group shared how after years of silence, her brother finally called to say thank you for teaching him self-reliance. These stories became small lanterns on my path forward. The biggest lesson was this: you can love your family deeply and still need space from their demands. Love without boundaries isn't really love, it's survival. As I leaned into this truth, my anxiety began to ease. I stopped trying to fix perceptions or win approval. I focused instead on showing up honestly and consistently for myself, and for those who truly respected my limits. The villain narrative gradually lost its power, replaced by a quieter, more authentic sense of self. And so I found myself at a crossroads, not defined by blame or regret, but by possibility. I was learning to let go of roles that no longer fit, and to trust that my story could be bigger than the one my family tried to assign me. The next steps would be about protection of my finances, my peace, and my future. For the first time, I felt ready to move forward, not as the family's fixer or scapegoat, but as Nora, someone learning to choose herself. After weathering the storm of blame and resentment, I realized that true protection requires more than just emotional boundaries. I took a deep breath and began the painstaking process of disentangling my finances from my family's reach. It meant closing joint accounts, updating passwords, removing my name from anything I didn't fully control. At first it felt drastic, even disloyal, but then I read stories about identity theft and financial abuse, how easy it is for family to cross the line when money blurs the boundaries. One article described a woman whose relatives opened loans in her name without consent. That fear pushed me to take every necessary step. Securing my accounts brought unexpected relief. I no longer woke up in the middle of the night, wondering if someone had drained my savings. Instead, I found myself with a new sense of safety and dignity. I reached out to a financial advisor, something I'd always delayed, thinking I needed permission to invest in myself. The advisor's first words stayed with me: protecting your assets isn't selfish, it's wise. It was empowering to hear a professional reinforce what I'd started to believe, that I was worthy of security and independence, even if my family couldn't see it. As I put my financial house in order, I discovered practical ways to keep myself safe, setting up credit alerts, monitoring accounts, documenting every change. I also learned about legal protections, how a simple consultation with a lawyer could shield me from future attempts to misuse my name or credit. It felt daunting, but also freeing. For the first time, I saw my future as something I could actively build, not just defend. And with every proactive step, I was reclaiming ownership of my life, not out of fear, but out of hope. One lesson echoed through all of this. Boundaries aren't just for emotions, they're for every part of our lives, especially our finances. I'd spent years feeling guilty for wanting space, worried that saying no would make me the villain forever. But in reality, protection is an act of love for myself, and even indirectly for those who needed to finally stand on their own. When we set firm boundaries, we show others what's possible when responsibility and respect go hand in hand. We teach by example that real relationships don't rely on silent sacrifice or blurred lines. With my financial ties finally severed, I felt lighter than I had in years. It was the end of an exhausting chapter, but also the start of something new. A life defined by choice, not obligation. I knew the road ahead would bring fresh challenges and perhaps moments of doubt. But I was learning that protecting myself wasn't a betrayal, it was the foundation for a future where trust, love, and security could finally coexist. And with that realization, I was ready to step fully into my own story. Building a life after cutting financial ties with my family felt like stepping into an unfamiliar world. At first, the quiet was almost unsettling. My evenings, once filled with phone calls about bills and emergencies, became time for myself reading long walks, the warmth of a dinner with friends. I started reaching out to people who knew me outside of my family story. One former coworker invited me to her book club, where nobody knew about my past sacrifices. It was refreshing to be seen not as the helper or ATM, but just as Nora, a person with her own quirks, dreams, and stories to share. The power of chosen family became real to me in those months. I met others at yoga class, in group therapy, through mutual friends who were also rebuilding their lives after breaking unhealthy cycles. There was Sarah, who'd left a controlling home and was learning to trust again, in Mike, who'd once been the fixer in his family and now spent his weekends volunteering. Our stories were different, but the relief in our laughter was the same. In these new relationships, I discovered a sense of belonging that didn't depend on sacrifice, obligation, or shared history, but on mutual respect and honest care. I realized I wasn't alone. More people than I'd ever imagined had chosen to build a new definition of family. I read about communities across the country, support groups, LGBTQ+ chosen families, even online forums where strangers became each other's safety net. The lesson was clear: blood may make us relatives, but trust and acceptance make us family. The courage to choose your own circle is not a rejection of your past, but a step toward healing. It's the permission to seek kindness, support, and joy on your own terms. There were setbacks, of course. Sometimes loneliness crept in, or old guilt whispered that I should call home and offer help again. But each time I reminded myself why I left and what I was building in its place. I practiced small acts of self-care, cooking my favorite meals, writing in my journals, seeking therapy when old wounds ached. These habits weren't just distractions. They were the building blocks of a life I was finally choosing for myself, not out of fear or duty, but out of hope for something better. As the seasons changed, so did I. I felt stronger, lighter, and more whole than I ever had while carrying my family's burdens. My new community, my chosen family, wasn't perfect, but it was real. We celebrated each other's growth and honored our boundaries. And as I looked toward the future, I saw not just survival, but possibility. A life where love is offered freely, not demanded. And where every boundary is a promise to care for myself and those who truly care in return. The final step I knew would be to share my story with others so they too could find the courage to choose freedom and belonging. Looking back on my journey, I see a path paved not only with struggle, but with discovery and growth. I learned that love without boundaries isn't really love, and that rescuing others can never come at the cost of losing yourself. From quietly patching every family crisis to bravely saying no, every step brought me closer to the life I wanted. Letting go of old patterns was hard, but it made space for a new kind of freedom. A freedom built on self-respect, chosen connections, and the understanding that my value isn't measured by what I give, but by who I am. The people I found along the way, friends, mentors, my chosen family, showed me that real belonging comes from acceptance and honest care, not obligation or guilt. I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. When you draw clear lines, you make room for the right people to step in. Those who see you, celebrate you, and support your growth. The loneliness I once feared gave way to real connection. And with every boundary, honored every act of self-kindness, I built a foundation strong enough to carry both myself and those I love, without ever losing who I am again. If you recognize yourself in my story, know that you're not alone. There are so many of us out there, the strong ones, the quiet helpers, the people who keep everyone else afloat. If you're tired, if you feel invisible, or if you're ready to choose yourself for the first time, let this be your sign. It's not too late to change your story, to set new boundaries, or to build the family you deserve. Healing starts the moment you say, I am worth protecting. And that one decision can ripple through your whole life. I hope you'll share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. If this journey resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe for more honest conversations about family freedom and self-worth, and join our community. Here your boundaries are celebrated, your courage is honored, and you are always welcome, just as you are. Together we can break old patterns and create new beginnings, one honest story at a time. Thank you for listening, for sharing, and for choosing a little more freedom one day at a time. Until next time, remember your story matters, and so do you.